of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago, where he teaches Bengali language and literature. He is also an associate researcher with the Unité Mixte de Recherche and a number. It means nothing to me, I'm afraid. I don't know what it means. But for the Iranian and Indian worlds, that much I understand, in Paris. And so he is a specialist in Bengali texts, and he knows a great deal about Islamic education in this region, in the Arakan region. And so he's going to talk to us about the languages of Islamic scholarship and the lettres in South Asian, Bangladesh, and Arakan. Welcome, Professor Dubey.
So first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. It's a great honor and a great pleasure for me who I've been working for many years in libraries and even libraries in far countries, but still in libraries like a bookworm. And so now it's very interesting for me to move towards the contemporary world and also contemporary issues and being able to contribute in some way to the current debates. So, whereas an abundant literature is available on the political situation of Muslims in Arakan and on the conditions of living of Rohingyas in refugee camps in Bangladesh and Thailand, the cultural history of the Muslim population of the region remains almost entirely unknown. The literature on the subject comprises some Bengali scholarship on the Bengali literature produced in the 17th century in Arakan, or on the political relations of Bengal and Arakan during this period. We also have some histories of the Muslims of Arakan written in English by contemporary Rohingya historians and a handful of academic publications in English that deal with political history and, to a lesser extent, literature. Except for a few studies surveying the Bengali literature produced in Arakan and a few articles on the role of Muslims in the Arakanese kingdom, the lack of reference to primary sources is a striking feature of the literature dealing with Islam in the region. Since we already discussed the ideological issues connected with the treatment of the cultural history of the Arakan frontier, I will here primarily provide an overview of the archive, the neglected primary sources on the basis of which we have to write this history. Contemporary scholars of Arakan's cultural and literary history can rely mainly upon two kinds of sources that we already mentioned to study the Islamic culture in the region. The few stone and coin inscriptions in which the languages of Islam that are Arabic and Persian were used, and a large number of manuscripts containing texts written in Bengali, one of the pre-modern vernacular languages of the region. It is important to note that all the material I'm using here is kept in libraries in Bangladesh, and so far I've not been able to trace the existence of any Bengali manuscripts in Myanmar today. The inscriptions and coins are often put forward in the literature produced by contemporary Rohingya historians. As compared to the information provided by Bengali literature, inscriptions give a very limited amount of information about Islam in the region. Another thing worth noticing is the very poor understanding scholars have of these sources. For instance, the famous multilingual coins minted by the kings of the Mraugu period are usually referred to as bearing inscriptions in Bengali and Persian. So we saw that there are Persian titles, as a matter of fact, which are specifically Persian, but the titles of the Arakanese kings are translated into Arabic and Sanskrit, so not Persian and Bengali. And it has some important implications in terms of how the Arakanese rulers meant to integrate their kingdom in cultural and political networks. Bengali and Persian point to the regional political scene, and more specifically to the neighboring Sultanate of Bengal, whereas Sanskrit and Arabic point to the larger networks of the Indian Ocean. Regarding the inscriptions, only fragments that must have been parts of religious buildings and and also some other kinds, like recording activities of merchants, are put forward. But the main inscription that was also mentioned, dated Hijri 900, so 1495 AD, was partially edited by ABM Habibullah in 1966 and published in Pakistan, in East Pakistan, and it still awaits to be critically analyzed. Actually, it has to be re-edited because he edited it from a picture, and it was... and there are much more things to get from it. So this is really the thing for the ancient period, and we basically know, we know nothing about its content. In spite of the frequent, though vague, references to Bengali literature in the Mrauku period, Bengali manuscripts provide a wealth of information which is still virtually unexplored. During the last decade, my research aimed at critically analyzing those sources for their literary, religious, and historical content. I hope this study allows me to provide here an informed overview of the Islamic literature in Arakan during the pre-colonial period. During the Mrauku period, so that is roughly 1430 to 1785, Bengali became the privileged means of literary expression for Muslims living in the kingdom. It is also worth mentioning that until well into the 18th century, southeastern Bengal and Arakan were the only regions in which Bengali language was used by Muslims to produce literary works. From the point of view of the study of Islam in Arakan, it is also the period for which we have the largest amount of written sources. It is comparatively more challenging to write an account of Muslim literature in the modern and contemporary periods due to the lack of access to Arakanese religious institutions, for instance. There were two centers of literary production during the first phase of this history: the rural areas around the port of Chittagong and the capital of the kingdom, Mrauku. Later on, in the late 18th century, another center of literary production was formed in Ramu. Technically, during this period, Ramu lied beyond the boundaries of Arakan, but its literary tradition is closely connected to the Bengali literature of Mrauku, and it also matches the flux of people moving outside of Arakan after the conquest. More generally, the accounts found in the prologues of the texts composed in Chittagong after the Mughal conquest of 1666 always refer to the Mrauku period. In terms of language and style, the 18th century Chittagongian literature is also reproducing the models elaborated in Mrauku. In the 19th century, Mughal intellectuals actively engaged in reforming the literary culture of Muslims in Chittagong and condemned their attachment to the works composed during the Mrauku period. This picture is conveyed by the works of the scholar Hamidullah Khan, who was born in the early 19th century and wrote a history of Chittagong in Persian that was published in 1881. In this text, that I know only through references in secondary literature in English, Persian, and Bengali, the author blames local Muslims for being fond of the works of poets from the Mrauku period, which contained too many references to Hindu culture. In the same vein, Hamidullah Khan composed several books in Bengali in order to reform the customs of Chittagongian Muslims. So it just changes also the perspectives that we have today, talking about Chittagongian influence of on Arakan. During the early colonial period, Chittagong was still very much culturally linked to Arakan. The main figures of the formation of the Bengali literary tradition of Arakan are Daulat Qadri and Alaol, who both lived in the mid-17th century. The influence of the latter on the authors who followed was tremendous. Daulat Qadri came from Chittagong in the western part of the kingdom in circumstances unknown to us. Alaol was captured in his native region of Faridpur in central Bangladesh by Luso-Arakanese raiders who brought him not back to Mrauku. He hailed from the local Indo-Afghan courtly milieu and became a royal slave in Arakan. His literary talents and his command over Persian, Awadhi, a pre-modern literary form of Hindi, Sanskrit, and Bengali, the regional literary idiom, made him a valuable member of the secondary courts of the Muslim ministers of the Buddhist kings of Arakan. He was a prolific author who penned 5 narrative poems translated from the Awadhi and Persian, as well as 1 versified treatise on Muslim religious practices, also translated from the Persian. individual lyric poems, works on music, and even Bengali lexicography. Alal's works are a unique window into... here is a manuscript of one of his works in the Bengali script. Alal's works are a unique window into the courtly culture of this time. They show the high degree of cosmopolitanism of the elite society of Mrabu. Part of Alal's literary culture was inherited from his youth in the Indo-Afghan milieus of Bengal, in which Sanskrit, Persian, and vernacular literary cultures were equally important. But his literary career was mainly shaped by the specific cultural, social, and political context of Arakan in the mid-17th century. The high level of Sanskritization of his literary idiom, that is to say the use of Sanskrit words and literary references in his use of the vernacular language, is due to the fact that Sanskrit was the medium of a shared literary culture among the elites of Arakan that comprised Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims. In spite of the Indic nature of his literary idiom, Alal's position regarding Islam was not syncretistic. His works display an inclusive, almost encyclopedic adab or cultural ethos, which is framed by a clear devotion to the principles of Islam. Islamic scholarship during his lifetime in Morocco consisted in the study of Quranic sciences, jurisprudence, the study of elementary Islamic principles through works like the versified Persian treatise composed in Delhi in the 14th century entitled Tohfai Nasoi, and the study of Hindavi, or Hindi, and Persian narrative poems, which were themselves encyclopedic works from which knowledge on a wide array of subjects, religious and not religious, could be derived. Finally, Alal's formal affiliation to the Qadiriya Sufi order implies the study of a set of texts dealing with tasawwuf or mystical sciences, but we do not know what the curriculum was exactly in Arakan during this period. It is also important to mention that beyond the institutionalized brotherhoods, Sufism was then part of the Muslim ethos and was virtually present at all levels of society, in one form or another. Hence, all the narrative poems composed by Alal contain some Sufi dimension. Besides the courtly poets, we also find several rural authors who composed religious texts. One of the first religious scholars of Bengali literature was Sayyid Sultan. He lived in the region of Chittagong towards the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. A later source from the 18th century claims that he used to receive gifts from the king of Arakan as tokens of respect. Sayyid Sultan wrote a monumental work on the lives of the prophets of Islam entitled Nobi Bongsho, as well as several treatises on Sufism. These treatises are early specimens of a genre that circulated in Chittagong and Arakan, in which Muslim imams and Sufi masters used to write down basic religious principles along with spiritual and yogic bodily practices aimed at fostering the observance of Islam, so a very local expression of Islam. Like Alal, but in a different domain, Sayyid Sultan was extremely influential, and he was repeatedly referred to and his works quoted by later authors who were sometimes his disciples or his relatives. Another Muslim author about whom I could only gather little information from a partial reading of a badly damaged manuscript kept at the Dhaka University seems to be a crucial source of information for later scholarship in Arakan. His name was Ainuddin, and he authored a versified Quranic commentary, a tafsir in Bengali, using several commentaries available to him. It is too early to provide a synthesis of the contribution of this text to our knowledge of Islamic scholarship in Arakan, but we can already mention a few significant data. In the colophon of his text, Ainuddin mentions that his teacher, who was an imam living in Roshang, so Roshang, the Bengali name of Arakan and its capital Mrau, from which the very word Rohingya is derived. We also learn that he started studying following the Indic curriculum by learning Sanskrit metrics and gnomic literature, that is the Chanakya Shloka and this literature. In his commentary, he mentions several other texts that he used in order to compose his own work. Among them, we find the Tafsir-e-Hosseini and the Kashful Asrar, two Persian commentaries of the Quran adopting a Sufi approach to the revealed text. So again, he gives some details about the shape of Islamic scholarship in Arakan in the 18th century, and so Persian was the medium of access to the Quran. He also mentions travels that he made, which should inform us about the inclusion of the frontier region of Arakan in the international Muslim networks in the 18th century. Finally, it is worth noticing that it is the only substantial Quranic commentary composed in pre-modern Bengali that I know. The literary multilingualism of the 17th century is different from what we find in the 18th and 19th centuries. There is continuity in the presence of Persian and Arabic as the main sources for Bengali authors, but there is a shift from the Eastern Hindustani vernacular to modern Urdu. Unlike West Bengal, in the region of Chittagong and Arakan, the literary form of Bengali used by Muslim authors remained virtually free from Arabic-Persian lexical influence, except in religious texts in which the technical vocabulary was borrowed from those languages. The discourse of some Rohingya historians may be somewhat misleading when it comes to talk about the ancient literary tradition of Arakan. For instance, when in 1961 Batha presented texts written in the Arabic script as being specimens of Rohingya literature, we have to keep in mind that the language of those texts is different from what is described in contemporary attempts to give Rohingya language a written form. And here I refer to Rohingya Lish or the Hanifi script that I'm going to mention. The language used in those texts is a literary idiom called pre-modern or Middle Bengali by contemporary scholars, of course. Thus, as in many other parts of northeastern South Asia, Bengali was the literary idiom of a local community of Muslims who spoke a linguistically distinct idiom, the Chittagongian or Rohingya dialect. The tradition of transcribing vernacular text in entirely vocalized Arabic naskh, as you have here in the tafsir of Ainuddin, is typical of the region of Chittagong and of Arakan. It is true that unlike Bengali script, it allows some dialectal features of the phonology to be recorded in the written text, but the overall grammatical frame of the language remains that of pre-modern or Middle Bengali. Again, the corpus of Bengali texts written in the Arabic script has been entirely ignored by modern scholars, and I'm currently working on some critical editions of those texts. Among the couple of pages one may find on the topic of Bengali text written in the Arabic script, the name of Alal appears several times. In his article on Arabic calligraphy in Arakan, again, Tahir Batha stated that Alal wrote his text with the Arabic alphabet. Unfortunately, we don't have any manuscript dating from the Mra'u period. All the manuscripts are from the late 18th and 19th centuries. Textual evidence from the region of Chittagong indicates that Arabic may have been used by some authors to write down vernacular literature in this period. So far, in the manuscripts, when mention is made of transliteration from one script to another, it is always from Bangla to Arabic, and not the other way around. But it seems clear that this tradition started during the Mra'u period and was maintained in the geographical area of the former kingdom of Arakan, that is, when it still comprised Chittagong, until the second half of the 19th century. Batha also claimed that all the vernacular Muslim texts of the region were written in the Arabic script, which is unfortunately impossible to verify, but it would constitute a distinct feature from Chittagong, where both scripts were used, Arabic being the exception rather than the rule. Batha seemed to be unable to read Bengali texts written in the Arabic script already in the 60s and expressed his regret regarding the loss of this tradition. In the 1980s, attempts have been made to introduce a new alphabet to transcribe Rohingya language. Maulana Hanif created an alphabet derived from Arabic but organized according to the syllabic system of South and Southeast Asian scripts derived from Brahmi. So here is another example of a Bengali, written in the Arabic script, and here is the Hanafi alphabet, the Rohingya Hanafi alphabet. The Rohingya Education Board and the Rohingya Language Committee published primers using this alphabet, but I have no information about its actual subsequent use to transcribe Rohingya, so I may collect more information from you. Already in the 1960s, Bengali as a means of literary expression seemed to be vanishing in Arakan in favor of Urdu. This is also illustrated by the gradual disappearance, according to Batha, of traditional Bengali song and theatrical performances that were replaced by Urdu Qawwali. During the British period, Urdu became the main language for religious education. Urdu is still used today in Rohingya madrasas in the refugee camp of Teknaf, for instance. I lack information about religious education in madrasas in Arakan today. There has been a strong dichotomy among Myanmar Muslims regarding the use of Burmese or Urdu as means for religious education. I must say that I could not gather any clear picture of the situation today from the secondary literature on Muslims in Myanmar, and a difficult field work study needs to be performed in order to provide answers to this question. Similarly, I have not been able to find any substantial references to Urdu or Burmese Muslim press in Myanmar today. For the early British period, a very valuable source was brought to my attention recently by Jacques Leider. It is Azadi Hassan's Urdu text entitled Qawmi Halat-e Musulmanan-e Burma va Rakhine, the state of the Muslim community of Burma and Rakhine. The manuscript of this text is preserved at the British Library, and a microfilm copy of it was sent to Dhaka University in 1977. In 2003, a Bangladeshi historian, Muhammad Akhtaruzzaman, published a brief account of the content of this text. It was apparently written sometime after 1946. Compared with other material available to us on the history of the Rohingya and more broadly Muslims in Myanmar, this text is especially valuable because of the personal history of its author. Azadi Hassan was the head of a madrasa in Sandway, and he hailed from a family of Arakanese Muslims. Like Ainuddin, a few generations earlier, his primary education took place in a non-Muslim context with a Buddhist teacher. Then he completed the traditional Islamic curriculum and became a madrasa teacher in Sandway. His experience as an Arakanese Muslim who was brought up and educated before the communal clashes of the late 1930s and early 1940s makes his account especially valuable. He also had access to Bengali texts produced in Arakan that do not seem to be extant anymore. For instance, he mentions a versified text on the history of Arakan entitled Roshan Panchali. He also gives the Persian title Tarikh-e Rakhine by an individual named Pandit Abdul Hossein Rakhine. Another potential, even the name is from another age somehow. Another potential source of original information is the often quoted but so far untraceable Urdu text written by Muhammad Khalilur Rahman entitled Tarikh-e Arakan. Like Azadi Hassan, Rahman was an Arakanese Muslim from a generation who saw Arakan before the communal violence. He claimed to be a descendant of Alaol and even indicated the location of the poet's tomb to a Bengali historian who met with him in Rangoon in the 1930s. When studying Islamic scholarship in Arakan, I faced a rather odd situation in which more material was available for distant periods than for recent times. Since I'm only beginning to gather information about the contemporary period, it is most probable that, that more data will appear as I proceed with my research. My survey of Bengali manuscripts written in the Arabic script is definitely a rich source of information for Islamic scholarship during the British period. I'm already working at locating Urdu newspapers from Burma that may provide more information as well, at least for the first half of the 20th century. Similarly, the manuscript of Azadi's work will be a valuable source of information for this period. From the perspective of the formation of the Rohingya identity, what I'm looking at is the early history of the formation of the Muslim community in Arakan. This is the history of a period when the Rohingya ethnic and cultural identity was not yet formed, and when regional cultures were not defined on the same lines as they are today. The chaotic political situation of Arakan since the end of the 18th century makes it very hard to distinguish a single narrative of the Muslim history of the region. But it is by seriously paying attention to the archives that are still extant that we will be able to provide a more nuanced and accurate account of Islamic culture in Arakan. On the other hand, I tend to think that the result of this scholarly endeavor will show us a complex cultural history that will be of no immediate use to contemporary political discourses.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.